Okay, now, as promised, I wanted to, of course, I won't go into too much detail in fear of pushing this video too far and making it too long. So, but just a brief discussion, if you're still interested, follows. Um, so, Corona bonds have come up in the news as we try to deal with the fallout from this pandemic, the economic crisis that has ensued. Of course, largely the response to the pandemic has been to increase government spending, accept the high amounts of government debt, because even in a crisis, essentially all capitalists accept that governments must act, and that is what happened. However, there are, of course, limits. None more so than in emerging economies where governments may be investors may fear that governments in emerging economies may default, even with their own central bank. But even in the advanced economies of the Eurozone, we have perceptions of the risk of default of sovereign nations, even as large as Italy and as old and as developed as Italy. Why is this happening? We touched on it a little bit I can't remember what week it was, but essentially we know that due to the way the Eurozone is structured, the ECB is not allowed to go and buy bonds directly, government bonds directly from its member states. So what it means is that for the UK, when it runs deficits, it has the assurance that the central bank will always be a lender of last resort, whereas in the Eurozone, the ECB is not. It doesn't fulfill the function of lender of last resort to the same extent. Let's put it that way. It's not a very good lender of last resort. So, which means that there have been calls to ensure that we have a commonly backed a commonly backed bond, backed by all the governments of the Eurozone, which would be used to finance those members that are in the most difficulty. Because, of course, financial investors see the likes of Greece, see that they are having difficulty raising the money they need in order to spend, in order to boost the economy. And they see that the ECB isn't necessarily in a position to buy all their bonds and be the lender of last resort, which makes financial markets afraid of default and therefore charge them higher interest rates, and those higher interest rates become a burden on the government as they're trying to use what money they have for fiscal stimulus, and instead they must pay higher interest payments. Now, Greece, of course, had this problem, 10 times or tenfold what Italy currently has, or more even. But nonetheless, Italy is facing higher interest payments at a time where many developed economies face negative interest rates on the government bonds. In an article in Bloomberg, this summarizes which countries were in favor of Corona bonds. Generally, there was quite a number, as we can see here. Largely the European South, or Southern European countries, I should say, and Ireland. But the main holdouts were the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. Now, we know from our lecture on current account imbalances, it's largely those economies that were running deficits and have been for many years that are arguing for Corona bonds as a way of ensuring that they remain liquid and have the access to finance that can be used for fiscal stimulus in a time like this, of pandemic. Let's have a brief look at the interest rates across the Eurozone to try to kind of, I don't have it open. I'll open it now. To hammer this point home, here we have data from the ECB on, on the long-term interest rates across the Eurozone. And this is, long-term, so 10 years. So after 10 years, the bond has matured and you're paid the face value, usually. And if we look at, say, let's hide them all. So we'll just play a game. So let's look at Austria, Germany, Spain, France, Greece, and Italy. Perhaps that will do. And the Netherlands. Now, first actually, let's go back to the very beginning. Creation of the euro. As we see, as these countries join the euro, they converge. Because the risk of one country defaulting just seems unthinkable. Whereas after the financial crisis, we see the cracks in the financial system that many economists, like Wynne Godley, for example, pointed out in the 1990s already, that the ECB is not a lender of last resort in the fullest sense, means that the risk of default and the interest rate that go along with them in Greece skyrockets, as we saw in the week on the Great Recession, up to around 28%. Crazy high, right? This is not sustainable if you want to really, especially if you want to use that money otherwise to boost the economy. And we see otherwise this fragmentation across the Eurozone, where here we have Spain and Italy at rather high interest rates too. Now let's kind of fast forward to today. Now we live in the crazy world of negative interest rates. Remember in our lecture on the Great Recession, we saw that the ECB had pushed its deposit rates at the ECB down below zero. His lending facility rate was then very close to zero as well, which meant that the interbank rate is gone into negative territory. So the benchmark, the sort of base rate of interest rates across the economy has gone negative, which means that the opportunities for investors to invest and get a high return is likewise really, really limited. In fact, rather than get a high return, some investors would rather their investment just hold its value over time, given the risk that they perceive that the economy is going to tank, or the world economy is going to tank, perhaps due to trade war with China or whatever the fear may be. Here in green we see, I think it is Germany, it is. And even in 2016, for a brief period, it had negative interest rates on its government debt. What does that mean? That means that the government effectively can borrow and be paid for borrowing, right? Let's fast forward to this year in particular. Since the beginning of the year, in fact by the end of 2019 already, Germany, what else do we have? The Netherlands and Spain, I want to say. Well, definitely France. We're in the negative interest rate territory. Right? So they're getting paid for taking out loans that they can use for spending. This is clearly not a debt risk. They're not at the risk of piling on the debt if they're even getting paid to take out those loans. So investors simply want their money back at a rate which is similar to what they paid for it. Yeah, and in fact they're willing to pay a little to have the stable value over time, because they fear that the economy is going to tank, or they fear that inflation will eat into their cash reserves. Right? Let's look at these economies at the top. Here we have, in fact, we have Greece and Spain. Of course, Greece is coming from a level which is much, much higher in years previous, and recently was able to join the ECB's quantitative easing program. So its rates are actually very low compared to the last decade or so. So Greece is doing relatively well, all considering, but Italy, such a large economy, has spiked in recent years in terms of the interest rates that it must pay on its debt. And don't forget, it's taking out, or needs to issue more debt than ever. If it cannot do so, then its ability to respond with fiscal stimulus to one of the worst coronavirus crisis, well, to the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression at least, is extremely limited and restricted. So this is where Corona bonds come in. Corona bonds is to say, we are all going to back this new financial instrument that allows financing for those countries that are most affected by, quite frankly, something which is completely not their fault, right? It's completely out of their hands that such a pandemic would hit them so hard. Why would it help? Well, because the Italian bond holders, the holders of these Coronabonds, these EU-wide or Eurozone-wide backed bonds, would have the assurance of not just the Italian government, but the German, the Dutch, the French governments that these bonds are good. Yeah, so you have the creditworthiness of all these economies in one. So it seems like a no-brainer. Why would you not want to help your fellow country, your fellow member of the Eurozone, kind of get back into strong positive territory in terms of growth, and especially in a time of suffering, due to the pandemic? Well, the fear of the Germans and the Dutch, in particular, is that in so doing, they will make the lending opportunity for themselves more expensive. So Corona bonds will increase the risk that they're exposed to, and therefore investors will, in some sense, charge them a higher interest rate if they want to issue new debt. This is, of course, a fear that is not necessarily based in any data. It's because it's a projective thing. We don't know, quite frankly. But let's at least point out the following. Firstly, you have you already have economies with negative interest rates. So even if their interest rates, due to the acceptance and issuance of Corona bonds, were to be increased by a few basis points, you would still be, pretty. You'd be pretty lucky. You'd be to be under such favorable financial conditions, right? So given this current situation, it just seems that the risk of not thinking about Corona bonds and issuing Corona bonds and coming together may actually be far, far greater than the risk of not getting involved at all. Because if these interest rates peak because Italy has to essentially go to the markets, ask for more finance, for more fiscal stimuli, then it could see its interest rates rocket like in Greece in years prior, right? Or worse, perhaps the Italian government simply tries to not spend so much, which only leads to suffering of everyday people who need access to healthcare or employment benefits or whatever the case may be. So that's the situation. It's a developing matter. There is a lot that is left to be done about it, and we will see, quite frankly, what will happen with somewhat bated breath. But let's see. That's all there is from my side for today's lecture. Of course, it is a bit longer today, given that I wanted to tack on something that was very relevant and a recent hot story, of course. I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward, as always, to discussing these matters and those related to it on Thursday in our usual Zoom call. I will see you then.